It's a shame, but I'll make the announcement anyway, let everybody know, Dan, through the museum. If you got a favorite topic, character, battle, event, anything that you want to talk about, just let me know and we'll schedule you. Maybe a favorite book. Maybe when Grant's book, the book about Grant comes out, we can talk about that one night. Sounds good to me. Speaking of books, our author who grew up in Norwood spent 16 years researching and writing this book about a gentleman, fought in over 300 battles and skirmishes, wounded 7 times, had 8 horses shot out from under him, spent 24 days and over 1,000 miles on his horse after he was wounded, chasing John Hunt Morgan, a man we're all familiar with. Wolford was arrested by direct order from President Lincoln, brought to meet him at the executive mansion. And this is new information about how Lincoln handled the Kentucky crisis and Wolford's descent. Like I said, Mr. Blair here spent his childhood in Norwood, strong ties to Kentucky, proud to be a Kentucky colonel. Spent much of his life here in Cincinnati, the Clifton Gaslight District, graduate of Xavier. He's done several publications with the Enquirer, the Lexington Herald magazines, contributing author of the book Kentucky Civil War, which won a Governor's Award. He helped his longtime friend, Dr. James Ramage, in the book Kentucky Rising, which Dr. Ramage wrote with his daughter, Dr. Watkins.
It's on the Wolford history. It was in there.
Very first biography of Franklin Wolford has been a lifetime work in the making. Can't wait to read it. Reveals history, U.S. history never told, which is a shame because there's a lot of that, especially lately. He's a member of the Civil War Trust for Preservation. If you ever go to a battlefield, pick up an envelope, throw a $5 bill in it, because next year, hopefully that battlefield will still be there. Do it again. I'd say except the Richmond battlefield, because that guy kicked that kid out of Eastern down there. We won't talk about that. And he still lives in Kentucky, lives in the bluegrass area of Lexington, and knows about horse races.
I know how to lose.
I'll have to tell you how to bet, because I've only lost on one horse race in my life.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming out. It's great to see my mentor here, Dr. James Ramage, he helped me through 16 years of research. I knew I was on to something. And so, speaking of rivalries, how about that Pittsburgh Bengals game? Well, it just kind of goes to show how rivalries can turn bitter, and instead of taking heads off, civil wars, they shoot heads off. And that's how things can escalate. I think I'd like to start off just talking about a nice summer day in the 1960s when I was a young lad. You know how you had clotheslines and clothespins and sheets were out there, and I was just a little young man, and the warm, gentle breeze was blowing. Oh, it looked like a sail, and so I thought, wow, that'd be kind of fun to play with. And so me and my twin brother decided to grab them and sail with them, run around the yard, and roll around in the soil, and soiled up these sheets. And my mother came out, and she said, "Well, George Johnson, why are you doing that?" So she broke up a switch, and chased us around, and we laughed, But then she said, "Wait till your father comes home." And first of all, we're like, "Who's George Johnson?" Yeah. And so our father comes home and he goes, Now, George Johnson, and he gave us a pretty good spanking. I'm like, well, now, who's this George Johnson guy? Well, now, does anybody know who George Johnson was in the Civil War?
He's a backup center for the Golden State Warriors at one time.
That's the problem with a common name like George Johnson. Yeah. But, yeah, he was the first provisional governor in Russellville, in Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that gave me a little hint, a little interest that, hey, maybe I'll be a scholar, because I sure remember that name.
Yeah, painfully.
And that also told me that most of my family were Union. Wolford, of course, started out Union. I don't know if he ended up that way. But we probably had some Confederates in our family, I'm satisfied. On September 22nd, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln wrote, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor I think Maryland. He's all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital. It is also claimed that Lincoln once said the following words, I would like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. A Kentucky colonel fighting for the Union, lost in history, teetered the tender political pendulum in a rivalry that almost swayed Kentucky to join the Confederacy, potentially resulting in a prolonged, if not a completely different outcome of the American Civil War. So I knew I was onto something, and this almost happened. And thanks for a lot of help from Jim, tying that in to the most important, one of the most important meetings in American history was after Wolford gave a speech in front of the governor. And we'll talk about that. The majority of Kentuckians at this time embraced the martyrdom of this battle-scarred warrior, one of the first to rally troops that had led them to fight for the Union, to preserve the nation in Kentucky military tradition. The colonel's legacy of his rivalry with John Hunt Morgan, the thunderbolt of the Confederacy, is awe-inspiring. The old wolf and his unruly bunch fought Longstreet in the Smoky Mountains for the strategically significant railroads. The once nationally recognized, determined politician and mountain fighter in his story has been buried in the shadows of obscurity for the most part until now. Now, my kids asked me, Dad, what are you doing writing about a racist? Because he protested against black enlistment. So that inspired me to say, let's look into this. What was the mindset? What was the mindset? It's no understanding of slavery. Like Jim used to say, slavery's wrong. You can't understand it. But can we understand the mindset? And I'd like to say, before anybody asks, I'd like to use Wolford's words. What did he think about slavery? Well, he came from the Henry Clay tradition. He believed in emancipation, but gradual emancipation. So did Lincoln. He was an old Whig. They were all old Whigs. These are the words from Wolford. I'm no apologist for slavery or copperheadism, but pray for the death of both. Yet I must do justice where we may. Okay. I hope they don't turn the lights on us tonight, off on us. I'm going to try to keep it pretty short if I can. Morgan's Raiders flew the rebel flag during the 1863 Great Raid, further into Northern Territory more than any other Confederate cavalry force during the Civil War. The raid started in Sparta, Tennessee, traversing across Kentucky, southern Indiana, and Ohio, and ended near the Great Lakes and Pennsylvania border. Another Kentucky cavalry force, a Union regiment commanded by Colonel Frank Wolford, or Wild Wolf, pursued Morgan's Raiders the entire way. Wolford was suffering from serious old battle wounds inflicted by Morgan's men a year earlier. It was the relationship between these two cavalry regiments that was strikingly mysterious. It was after the Civil War that Morgan's second-in-command wrote, in reminiscence of General Basil Duke, the attitude which the soldiers of Morgan's command and those of some of the Kentucky Federal Cavalry regiments held towards each other during the greater part of the Civil War was a kind which would have been termed by martinets, highly irregular, at least to all military etiquette. Duke went on to admit that the relations were unusual and peculiar and that they could only get away with this behavior in the volunteer service. Duke emphasized this was especially the case with regard to the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry and Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. Duke claimed that the differences between these two very active bodies of light horse were purely political and did not seem to affect their personal social relations in the least. Morgan's men had been recruited mainly from the Bluegrass region, and Wolford's mainly from the South Central and the Bluegrass, 13 different counties. Duke described both cavalry regiments as being similarly composed in character of reckless, daredevil youngsters, always eager for adventure and excitement. Both regiments rivaled each other early in the war, a rivalry that continued with scarcely any intermission until the close of the Ohio Raid. According to Duke, both regiments had similar assignments, reconnoitering, scouting in front, and or assigned as the rear guard of large respective forces. So they engaged frequently. Duke wrote that the most of the battles and skirmishes between the two regiments were sharp and closely contested, and that a strange sort of friendship developed between the prisoners of each side. Duke noted that there was a special compassion that had developed between the commanders of these two rival regiments when he wrote, "Between Morgan and Wolford especially, there was a warm and mutual regard. In our numerous encounters with them, old Frank was more than once wounded, as much to our regret, perhaps, as his own." But contrary to Duke's kind words, the Morgan and Wolford rivalry was at the same time a hard-fought and bitter rivalry. After the Battle of Lebanon, Tennessee, when the cavalrymen of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry first learned that their commander, Wolford, had been seriously wounded from gunshots fired by Morgan's men, they sought retribution on prisoners and handled them very roughly. The chaplain of Wolford's cavalry, Chaplain Ronald, related in an incident that occurred towards the end of the Great Chase, and you probably remember this, David. When some of Morgan's men were being rounded up as prisoners, one of Wolford's men rode up to Reverend and mistook him for General Shackelford and said, "General, I have a request to make. I have a brother-in-law in this Morgan gang. I wish you'd allow me to shoot him." And Ronald responded by threatening his arrest and court-martial, but years after the war, Ronald did write, "This incident is only related to show the average hatred of Wolford's men to revenge both then and since the war." Wolford has been described as an unpretentious man with an unassuming presence. As you can see, what do you see when you see Wolford? You see his picture right there. High cheekbones?
Yeah.
Some people say it looks like a Cherokee Indian.
Yeah.
So I might have a little Cherokee Indian. And of course, they didn't talk about that back then, you know, and that's why it kind of went away. But he just kind of looked like a Cherokee chief on a warpath. But anyway, he was an unpretentious man with an unassuming presence from a humble middle-class upbringing. He was essentially, in appearance, the antithesis of his rival. Morgan was from a Southern aristocratic background and, in a sense, represented the past economic success of the antebellum South. Morgan's knightly appearance fused well with his Southern charm and his gentlemanly graces. Morgan was well-dressed and stately. According to Savyard, a writer, Wolford, on the other hand, was the most ungainly man in the army, and certainly the worst dressed. He wrote, sometimes his boots were not mates, and they were ever innocent of policy. Sometimes he had one shoulder strap to indicate his rank, rarely two. Despite their differences, both Kentuckians had admirable qualities as independent cavalry commanders, and both were considered cool-headed leaders during the heat of battle. Despite being rivals, they had an honorable military respect for each other, and for the most part, followed the chivalry code of honor, the rules of engagement during the countless number of engagements during the war. Wolford and Morgan differed in ideology. They were Kentuckians. They had different definitions of liberty. And so did another Kentuckian, Abraham Lincoln. Wolford was a popular Kentucky attorney and politician, as well as an accomplished cavalry commander. He was an intrinsically gifted orator that knew his audience and understood the artistic power of vernacular. In great contrast to the style of his debonair nemesis, John Morgan, Wolford was characterized in manner and speech as a typical mountain man at the time. He spoke with the style and accent of his regional language and what some people would call hillbilly today. The word sit was pronounced sot, and for help, Wolford pronounced hope. And he favored the word fetch, and for a neuter pronoun it, he used the word hit. For commands, he used a series of non-military commands, such as form a line right over there, and huddle up, boys, and scatter out, and get up and get, boys. For the frontal attack command, he ordered, huddle up and push forward. His enfilade command was scatter and shoot across them. When he wanted a flanking move, he commanded his men to scatter up and scooch behind him. Regular Army officers complained about the effectiveness of Wolford's nonconformist military commands and his refusal to drill his men according to Army protocol. In early 1863, during an inspection of the Army of Cumberland, Wolford and his cavalry was highly scrutinized. After enduring much criticism from the high command, Wolford had heard enough. I know nothing about your drills, your evolutions, and your maneuver. My boys know how to ride and how to shoot, how to fight and how to stand fire. You may take 2 Yankee regiments over there, those Michigan regiments. He goes, you can take them, station them anywhere you please on any ground, any town, or any country, field or forest. I will take my regiment, and what I don't kill of them, I will chase out of the state of Tennessee in 48 hours. The boys came out to whip the rebels back into the Union. After hearing Wolford's response to harsh criticism from the inspection officer, they allowed him to continue to command his men in the informal style that up to that point in the war had remarkably been fairly effective. He fought well enough in the mountain terrain of East Tennessee that he was eventually granted a division to command. He also was granted a division to command in Kentucky at one point, holding the rank of colonel. He had a hawk-like appearance with his dominant nose and his broad mouth, with his coarse black hair and high cheekbones. He also had features that resembled the native Indian that we talked about. His regimental clerk, Sergeant Easton Tarrant, wrote that when Wolford was skirmishing with John Peterman's force in Danville in March of 1863, Wolford was wearing his war paint face, and that he was itching to fight. Being outnumbered, he was ordered to fall back. Historian Hamilton Taft said once that Wolford could stare an eaglet blind. But instead of being called the hawk, he was sometimes referred to as the wolf. It's also called the Blue Knight of the Green River. He often wore a red floppy hat and a brown farmer's jacket. Sometimes he was out of uniform. He didn't care. And then sometimes he did that, for scouting purposes. I don't know, Jim, if there were rules against that, but he did it anyway. Hearing his strong backwoods dialect often gave one the impression that he was a simple mountain man, but no, he was a well-known lawyer and politician and mountain cavalry commander. A lot of stories were written about him. He was famous back then. He was famous not only in Kentucky and written in the Louisville papers, which were nationally distributed, but he was also popular in Richmond papers in Virginia and Chicago and New York papers. Even though his story has national significance today, probably anybody's ever heard of him, but he nearly changed the landscape of our country with his protests. We almost had a North and a South because of this one man's incredible oratory at the Melodeon Hall, which, this is a strange story. I didn't think the Melodeon Hall still existed. And he gave his speech on March 10th, 1864. And so I was doing some research on my computer. What? The Melodeon Hall is still here. It's right on the edge where they had demolished all these old buildings. It almost got demolished. But I found that there was this huge effort to save the building. So, you know how you touch the button on your computer, and I'm writing it, and it says that today's date, 150 years later, to the day that he gave a speech, I found out. flip me out. Well, we talked about he was wounded 7 times. He fought in so many battles, 300 battles and skirmishes. Battle of Wildcat Mountain, he was on the front line. Battle of Mill Springs, he was on the front line. Lebanon, Knoxville, Buffington Island, Ferryville, to name a few. He wasn't on the front line there, that's why he's alive. But he did have, there was an incident where he saved Henry Thomas from capture from Joe Wheeler's charge. And that's in the book. Let's move on here. Of course, the extreme and bold determination manifested in this 24-day marathon ride by both Morgan and Wolford in the Great Chase is today hard for us to imagine. You know, when he was severely wounded a year before that in Lebanon, they thought he was dead. You know, they found him, and I've been on that road. It still looks like it would have looked during the Civil War. And he was trying to get away, and he was being held as prisoner. But they found Wolford. They thought he was dead. He was laying in a puddle of blood. His horse had been pushed so hard that it was dead, laying beside him. And anyway, 2 months later, he has somebody pull him up on his saddle to chase Morgan again. And then, of course, the Great Chase, a year later, he's still bleeding his saddle and fading because of the loss of blood. Can you imagine? After the Battle of Buffington Island, when Morgan and a number of his men slipped away further north, General James Shackelford, with Wolford as second in command, volunteered to lead a force to continue the chase. Now, I think we know the story about how Burnside had sent by rail to cut him off because, miraculously, he goes through Indiana. There's 50,000 Indiana militia following him. He goes through Ohio, there's an estimated 50,000 militia following there. And he still couldn't catch him. But you had like the tortoise in the hare. You had Shackelford and Wolford and that command just keeping the push, keeping on his tail. And then when Burnside said the force of fresh horses, fresh Kentucky horses, with Major Rue, correct, George Rue, leading them, and some other regiments, but some of the 1st Kentucky soldiers were also included on that train. So it kind of reminds me of Western movies. Horses jumping out of the train, and we're going to get him now, you know. So they finally got him. But after the Battle of Buffington Island, when Morgan and a number of his men slipped away further north, General James Shackelford, with Wolford as second in command, volunteered to lead the force to continue the chase, and according to Tarrant, Morgan, the dashing, thunderbolt of the Confederacy, eventually surrendered his sword, horse, and silver spurs to Wolford in northeastern Ohio, near the Pennsylvania border, to end the Great Chase. After the surrender, Wolford invited his prisoners, Morgan and his officers, to dinner at a hotel in Wellsville, Ohio. I could imagine a picture. I wish someone had taken a camera with them. Because if you can imagine these two contrasting figures sitting down at a table next to each other, that would be just extremely valuable. Lincoln offered Colonel Frank Wolford the rank of Brigadier General for his role in capturing his nemesis. Wolford declined the honor, stating one regiment was trouble enough without having a whole brigade to manage. Now, can you imagine that telling the chief? You're telling the chief, no, I don't want to do that.
Was that before or after their meeting in the executive?
Oh, that was before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
They liked each other. Kind of. But anyway, Lincoln, and Jim told me once that Lincoln had actually had people arrested that wouldn't take that promotion. Lincoln ignored Wolford's refusal by giving him a brigade to command, even though he retained the rank of colonel. Lincoln telegraphed Wolford, "You should be a brigadier whether you take the brigade or not." During Burnside's strategically significant invasion of East Tennessee at one point, Wolford would command an entire division. And he suffered through 1863 and 1864, the Battle of Knoxville. They thought They thought he was going to die at one point. You may find this very strange, but guys didn't look at it back then. But he was so cold during that siege that he said that a man by the name of General Jones, it's funny how he called him General Jones, because, you know, he was a Confederate general. But he said, a man by the name of General Jones, I was freezing to death, I was nearly gone. And he laid on top of me and I came back to life. You know, some people say, I don't know if I tell that story. But anyway. Now, there's another thing he did too after that battle. I mean, he was on point. They called him Thomas's Secret because after the Battle of Chickamauga, George needed to retreat from Snodgrass Hill back to Chattanooga. And when Wolford came down at Point with his forces and drew Confederates, which gave Thomas time to retreat back to Chattanooga, but he suffered dearly for it at the Battle of Philadelphia, and he was ridiculed for that. But at least he was able to charge out with part of his men. But he lost something like 700 captured. But at the same time, he took a hit for the team, basically. But unfortunately, some of those boys went to Andersonville. But now we're going to talk about the political rivalry. Wolford's political rivalry with the radical Republicans, as they were called back then. And we all talk about, the Republicans seemed like they were the liberals and Democrats were the conservatives. True. But anyway, it was Lincoln's policies and butcher Stephen Burbridge over the issues of the suspension of habeas corpus and black enlistments. This got him in trouble. On March 10th, 1864, at the Millennium Hall in Lexington, Wolford was presented with a jeweled sword, sash, pistols, and spurs by distinguished Kentuckians, including Governor Bramlett, for his role in capturing John Morgan. But in his acceptance speech, Wolford seized the opportunity to deliver a long oration on the subjects that entered most every Kentuckian's mind at the time. Many Kentuckians were afraid of being heard on the subject. They were afraid that they would be arrested and not granted a trial. They were concerned that they would be labeled a Southern sympathizer, and as a result, their property would be taken away from them. They would be labeled a Southern sympathizer, and sometimes they were killed. As a powerful speaker, the battle-scored Wolford was referred to as the harp of 1,000 chords, and didn't appear to be afraid of anything. Wolford didn't just blame the military dictator of Kentucky, General Stephen Burbridge, and his radical Republicans for the way Kentucky citizens were being mistreated. He pointed the blame at President Lincoln and the administration. Now, I guess you know that that's against the rules when you're in the military. You can't talk about your chief like that. What's that called, Article 5 or something like that. So yeah, he did violate that. But he claimed, I'm a politician, I'm allowed, you've got freedom of speech. And when you're in the military, you just can't do that. But he boldly charged Lincoln with wantonly trampling upon the Constitution and crushing the rights of the people under the iron heel of the military power. Wolford deemed the enrollment of slaves into the Union Army as unconstitutional and usurpation of power. Wolford was quoted as saying, the government of the United States is being crucified between two thieves, thieves in Richmond and the thieves in Washington. That's pretty harsh words, but if you think about it, they're a border state. Kentucky's a border state, and so you had Union armies coming there, taking their houses for headquarters, taking their stock. Everybody wanted to stock, you know. They had great horses and cattle. And then you'd have Southern armies coming in doing the same thing. And he probably could have said a third, because then you had guerrillas coming through and taking their horses. Anyway, he also boldly charged Lincoln with wantonly trampling on the Constitution. He had been a Whig and stood for the Constitution, gradual emancipation of slaves, but he vehemently protested the enlistment of slaves into the military, and he represented the opinion of most Kentuckians of the time. This tells you how prevalent not only in Kentucky, but in the north and south. And Bud Robertson just gave a talk in Lexington. He brought up this issue because there's a lot of sensitivity, there's a lot of tension going on even today. And he said, the whole world felt like that. They felt like they were an inferior being. We know that's not true. However, not all Kentuckians applauded Wolford's speech, as diarist Francis Peter wrote. Had he been bought over by the rebels, or had he caught the Negrophobia and known not what he did? But let not such men as Wolford think that they could persuade Kentucky to resist the government on account of the Negro. I will not follow any such lead, and the only thing they will do by preaching such a doctrine will be to destroy all hopes of getting compensation for the slaves that are taken by the government. But if we were to try to go back and get glimpses of their position, hard to do. We're not there. We didn't have that experience. It's not in our mind. Why do you think Kentuckians were so resistant, the majority, to black enlistment? Can anybody come up with a thought? I've got 7 listed. I think one that I don't have listed while you're thinking about that. Wolford himself thought, well, there's 4 million slaves. Now, let me calculate this. If they get the right to vote, and that's what they're afraid of, that's the political rivalry. That's the thing that people don't talk about, the Civil War. There was a political rivalry, and one political party was able to gain by gaining those votes.
How many Republican presidents followed Lincoln?
Well, I go into the post-war too.
Yeah, Johnson, Grant.
Yeah.
Well, Johnson was a Democrat, though, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, and he named,
Well,
he
of
didn't
course,
get elected.
you had the Jim Crow laws. There was the backfire. There was a backfire, especially in Kentucky, when the Confederates, after the war, started gaining office. And that led to the Jim Crow laws. But let's just kind of stick to this. What was in their mind about, what did they fear more than anything? One, they looked at the Constitution. Slaves were protected. Slavery was protected by the Constitution. Wolford was a lawyer. It's true. So Kentuckians in the slave state argued that the government was forcefully taking away citizens' property. And what was this against in our amendments? The amendment that you think protected people from having a right to refuse testimony was the same one that protected the property.
The eminent domain, isn't
No, it was the Fifth Amendment.
it? Right.
And you think of the Fifth Amendment, well, that's not right. But there's a taking property clause. And that says, we shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Here's another thing they were afraid of. They were fearful of insurrection. You know, there was the Nate Turner rebellion, West Indies, there were rebellions there. There was the armed slave revolt of 1848, where 75 armed slaves from Fayette County fought 100 men on their way to Ohio. And they blamed it on the abolitionists from Ohio, who came in there and stirred it up. And they believed that was for political purposes as well. You know, why are these outsiders coming in? In Lexington, if you think about during the Civil War, there were 50%, the population was 50% slaves and former slaves in Lexington. So if you think about that, and then there's thought about freeing them and then giving them guns, for a former master, that's alarming. It ended, then there was the Panic of 1856, where 600 slaves were expected to attack in Hopkinsville. Some of the stuff was just panics and rumors, but that's how, they were just so afraid because of that. And then there was a Panic of 1861 in Owenton County, where 300 to 400 slaves resisted being disarmed. Slave riots, rumors, and conspiracies, like the one in Lexington in 1810 and the one in Harlan County in 1842. So they thought, if you give them the vote, we're going to become the slaves. And that's what Wolford thought, that they'll take the power, and then the white race would become slaves. And it is true. They thought, I mean, this was their mindset. And then they also thought, if you take away our slaves and what's to become of our crops at a time when the ravages of war have already diminished food supplies, are we going to starve? They thought this was a war that began to preserve the Union not to take the way of life. And it did. Lincoln had in his first inaugural promise that he was not going to touch the black element, the slave element. And of course, as the war went on, and he warned them, he said that, you know, he gave them a couple opportunities, the delegates of the border states, you can come up with a number to be compensated. If you don't, by mere friction of war, you're going to lose them anyway. And that's pretty much what happened, except for the steps. I mean, you got to think about there was the Constitution Acts, the two of them, which is basically emancipation. And many believe, like Wolford, that if you enlist a slave in the army, then many otherwise potential white recruits will refuse to enlist and would rather not fight beside black men. They felt to fight as a soldier in the military was a great honor, and that a slave was an inferior being not worthy to be in uniform. These are harsh words, but that's truly how they felt. Many believed also that the sovereign Commonwealth of Kentucky should be in charge of recruiting troops, not the national government. Many were against the first draft forced by the United States. It was the individual states that had organized militia and troops in wars previous to this, and so yeah, this was a huge switch. Many Kentuckians believed that the enlistment of blacks was the first step, and it was the first step in emancipation. I think they knew that, even though Lincoln handled Kentucky very delicately, knowing how important Kentucky was. By 1864, the enrollment came in, and they're like, oh no, here it comes. This is how they're going to do it. And then eventually the enlistments by summer 1864. On March 24th, 1864, Wolford was dishonorably dismissed from the service by direct order from President Lincoln. At one point, Wolford was ordered under arrest for discouraging enlistments and was brought to Washington in shackles. And of course, Secretary of War Stanton, when he came off the train, he saw him in shackles. And, he's kind of ruffled all the time anyway. Get those shackles off that man. Don't you know? Been wounded 7 times. 8 horses shot under him. So they took the shackles off of him. There's some funny things in here. I just don't have time to talk about that. Wolford had gained infamy and national attention, and when the Chicago Tribune wrote, Colonel Wolford of the Federal Army in Kentucky had got some credit for services as a cavalry leader, but he foolishly threw away everything in a fit of ravings that will at times come upon pro-slavery zealots. The president has taken the rampant Negrophobia at his work and cast him into the outer darkness where rebels and secesh gnashed their teeth against loyalty. Wolford met with Lincoln in the Executive Mansion at Lincoln's request, and he admitted to making comments about the country being crucified between 2 thieves and said that he was ready for trial. And this is what's interesting. This is the story. I can't give it all away, but this is the most interesting part about how Lincoln handled the whole Kentucky crisis. He promised Wolford a trial and then sent him on to Louisville on a temporary parole. The terms of the parole that Wolford would receive a trial. In the meantime, he would refrain from giving speeches and would remain in Louisville. Weeks went by and Wolford was not granted a fair and speedy trial. So Wolford notified Lincoln of this, and after not hearing back from him, he then returned to his political activity, delivering orations. So he's like, okay, we got a deal here, right? Okay, I'll go to Louisville. He wanted a trial. I mean, he was great at oration. He wanted to defend himself. And Lincoln did. He said, I'll give it to you. But this is not a speedy trial. But not before writing his letter to the president in reaction to a new parole that Lincoln had sent him. He was so good in oration, and it was kind of dicey what Lincoln did. This is a presidential election year, if you think about it. And Wolford was the presidential elector for his opponent, McClellan. And so to have the presidential elector representing his opponent in an important state, to have him arrested, ooh, you know, if they did that today, I don't know. But in this new parole term, all this correspondence is in here between the two. Lincoln would not grant Wolford a trial, but would parole him on the condition that he would refrain from giving speeches. So, he's telling him you can't go out there and give speeches. So this is what Wolford had to say about that. In Wolford's famous letter to the president, which is in here, Wolford refused to sign the parole and wrote, "No, sir. As much as I love liberty, I will fester in prison or die on a gibbet before I will agree on any terms that do not abandon all charges against me and fully acknowledge my innocence." That presidential year, Wolford went on a political campaign as the president-elector in favor of Lincoln's opponent. Historian Ellis Merton Coulter wrote in the Civil War and Readjustment in Kentucky, Wolford became the hero of the day and was everywhere applauded. And it's true. There's an account where he went to Louisville in the theater, and the Governor Bramlett was up there in a high position, and Wolford was up there too. And when Wolford walks in, I mean, they're like, okay, here's the governor. And then when Wolford walks in, they're like, you know. So just a rapturous applause. So he was the hero of the day. But then reports were widespread that some politicians were taken off the ballot in elections. Democrats were being detained and restricted from voting. And black Union soldiers, once slaves, were now armed with bayonets and were intimidating voters at the polls. It's true that they were given lists of Democrats' names, and if they were to come in and to vote, they were arrested. I mean, the civil rights of citizens throughout the country wasn't just in Kentucky. It was worse than ever in the history of our country. People talked about Lincoln in a bar in Wisconsin. Got arrested. Can you imagine all the conversation about politics today and everybody getting arrested? Outraged by the reports, Wolford announced in a public speech, "The man who stands between me and the polls on the day of the ensuing presidential election will die." And so on November 8th, no one dared an attempt to prevent Wolford from voting as he proudly cast his vote for McClellan. However, a few days after the election, Wolford was again ordered under arrest. This was his fourth arrest. And this is what happened. Burbridge, he was one of those guys who was, it was political. Yeah, and so that's how he manhandled things. And so he got mad because Lincoln didn't win in Kentucky. He won the election, but he didn't win in Kentucky, and so he thought, I'm going to arrest you. The events that took place after Wolford's fourth arrest are even more intriguing, if this were to happen today. Burbridge had ordered the arrest and banishment to the south of Frank Wolford and the lieutenant governor of the state of Kentucky, Richard T. Jacob. He also arrested Paul R. Shipman, one of the editors of the Louisville Journal, and General John B. Houston, a prominent Lexingtonian. Wolford was removed from his home and taken in secrecy to an Oddfellow Hall that had been converted into a prison in Covington, Kentucky, with plans to banish him to the Confederacy.
Fifth and Madison.
The Oddfellows Hall, I remember, I can't remember, that's right, and it was around 2005.
Yeah.
I told my wife, I said, I saw it on the news, I'm like, oh, I wanted to go down there, I wanted to see, because they describe it as a dungeon. And so it was in flames. I mean, we got there so fast, I felt like, you know, one of those guys who chases fires. But yeah, that was a real pity. This makeshift prison was also a holding place for other Kentucky prisoners. Many of them were women who were then put to work sewing Union uniforms. He also found himself being held captive along the captured Confederate soldiers, the very people he had fought against. The arrests of Wolford, Jacob, Shipman, and Houston were viewed as acts of punishment from Stephen Burbridge, since McClellan had won the election in Kentucky. On November 22nd, Governor Thomas Bramlett telegraphed the President, notifying that Wolford and Jacob had been detained by secret inquisition, and to either order the release at once or suspension of the order. Lincoln responded the very same day in his nice little casual, calm way. It seems that Lieutenant Governor Jacob and Colonel Wolford are stationed there now. General Sudworth and Mr. Hodges are here, and the Secretary of War and myself are trying to devise means of pacification and harmony for Kentucky, which we hope to effect soon, now that the passion-exciting subject of the election is passed. But weeks went by while Wolford was still being confined secretly in Covington, and Jacob had been banished to the capital city of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Bramlett again wrote the president complaints about Burbage radical Republicans, afraid to avow their infamy in the face of an open tribunal, face-to-face with the men they accused. Mr. President, do stop these miserable, cowardly stay-at-home everybody patriots from giving such aid and comfort to the rebellion. Better send the accusers off, for they will not help us in the day of battle. Jacob and Wolford will. Now, I hope that you understand I can't give everything. I'm telling a lot here. I can't give it all out. I'll ruin it for everybody. But what I can tell you is that there is new information. And what happened after this, you got to know. But hopefully you can buy the book and read it. The proceeds, by the way, go to Camp Nelson today. Sure.
That part about, like, the people that spoke bad about Lincoln,
Yeah.
where they would be arrested and whatever,
Right.
was that a throw-off from the habeas corpus thing where he butted heads with?
Very much so.
And which-
Very much. There's a letter in here that is the missing link that I found on eBay on how Lincoln handled Wolford and the Kentucky crisis. And I called up Jim the very next day, and I said, you're not going to believe this. I was looking for something else on the computer. And I found this letter regarding Wolford on eBay for sale. It wasn't even in the Lincoln papers. And so it was authenticated. I tracked it down. I got permission to print it. I told the people in Springfield, Illinois about it. They wanted a copy of it. I got permission from an auction house in New York. And they couldn't tell me who bought it, but they told me that what they could say is he was an investor from overseas. And he bought it for around $30,000. But it is the missing link. It's a short letter, but it tells you exactly how he handled his dissent. And I will tell you, he had no intention on allowing Wolford to promise trial. To answer your question, yeah, the elimination of habeas corpus, we got to rethink that whenever that's done, because during the Civil War, I think the country is more volatile. The civil rights are more volatile at any time.
Complete paranoia.
Well, exactly. And people say, well, yeah, it was the Civil War. Yeah. No, that's when you really got to look out for your rights. You really, because it's so easy to have your rights taken away from you.
And then Burbage was not really in favor, like, he fell out of favor with Lincoln because of what he did with a lot of the prisoners and that, didn't he? Because
he had a lot on his hands.
Yeah, and then that cost Kentucky. I remember Jim telling us one time about if you go around the whole state of Kentucky, there might be like, what, 60-some statues, and about three-fourths of them are Confederate soldiers because of what Burbage, because of the stuff that he pulled.
Order number 59 is probably what he's referring to, because that when you took innocent, some of them boys, Confederate soldiers, and it was what, 1 for 4 or 5, I think, if a Union citizen was violated by a guerrilla, they would, or even a Confederate, they would just go and take innocent prisoners, take them out, and execute them. Yeah, and how many, I think there's an estimate, but who knows? I've heard estimates of what, 50 or 60? 60 something, and that's just not right. And guess who signed that order? President Lincoln signed that. It took him a while, and you know, there were delegations from Kentucky that went to Washington complaining about this, so he knew about it. One could argue that maybe he waited a little bit too long and maybe turned the other way, because one thing he wanted was that 13th Amendment. And of course, you know, Kentucky revolted after that. And it wasn't until 1976 that Kentucky ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. This lingered on a long time. I have more. I kind of want to, I do want to say this real quick, because this is such an important letter. Lincoln argued in his short letter, we call his short speech, when he read this to Wolford when he was with him in Washington. Wolford wasn't buying it, but I'm going to read that to you to conclude, because I think it's such an important letter. And I've shortened it a little bit. I've shortened the short speech. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think so and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestrained right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. It was in the oath that I took that I would, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I could not take the office without taking the oath, nor was it my view that I might take the oath to get power and break the oath in using the power. I understood, too, that in ordinary civil administration, this oath even forbade me to practically indulge my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery. I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution to the best of my ability imposed on me the duty of preserving, by every indispensable means, that government, that nation, of which that Constitution was organic law. Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? And he's talking about really breaking the Constitution by his Emancipation Proclamation without congressional approval. And Wolford argued every line in this speech in his letter to the president. Lincoln used sort of an analogy. There are a lot of amputations going in that war. And in his analogy, he said, wouldn't it be better to take a limb in order to save a life, to save that body? And Wolford argued, he said, no, you take that Constitution, that is the life. That is the body. But when you read this book, you'll see that mindset that they had back then. When in March and May and July of 1862, I made earnest and successful appeals to the border states to favor compensated emancipation, I believed the indispensable necessity for military emancipation in arming the blacks would come, unless averting by that move. They declined the proposition, and he gave them that chance. And I was, in my best judgment, driven to the alternative of either surrendering the Union with it, the Constitution, or of laying strong hand upon the colored element. I chose the latter. In choosing it, I hoped greater gain than loss, but of this I was not entirely confident. More than a year of trial now shows no loss by it in our foreign relations. Wolford's not going to agree with this. Nor our home popular sentiment, none in our white military force, no loss by it in any how or anywhere. On the contrary, it shows a gain of quite 130,000 soldiers, seamen, and laborers. These are palpable facts about which, as facts, there can be no cavilling. We have the men, and we could not have had them without the measure. I add a word which was not in the verbal conversation. In telling this tale, I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. They, just like a lot of wars, all thought God was on their side. Battle of Wildcat Mountain. Wolford was stopped on his way to the Battle of Wildcat Mountain, and by women. They're like, oh, they're coming, the Zollicoffer's army's coming. And Wolford said, don't worry, God's on our side. Here comes Zollicoffer with flags. It was in Latin, God's on our side. But to conclude here, I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. Now, at the end of 3 years' struggle, the nation's condition is not what either party, any man devised or expected. They thought Providence was going to say who was right. God alone can claim it. Whether it be tenny seems plain. If God now wills the removal of a great wrong, and wills also that we of the North, as well as you of the South, shall pay dearly for our complicity In that wrong, impartial history will find therein new cause to attest and revere the justice and goodness of God. And that was signed on April 4th, 1864, just weeks after Wolford's Bolognian talk. Thank you. You guys have been great.